We see how children play games and they get really so into it, and even adults. I mean, they love playing games because they really feel immersed in this environment. And I think now many laboratories would have professional programmers or game designers involved. So we are all gamifying our tasks, because especially to try to make these experiments more engaging, given that we are not actually going to threaten the human subject in real life, and that would not be ethically so right to do. And so games are a great example. Hi, my name is Hak-Wan Lau. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist working mostly with human subjects. I study the human brain. I'm currently based in Japan, but I used to be in LA at UCLA when this project started. I was studying how to intervene and manipulate the neural circuitry for survival in humans. And obviously in human subject testing, that's also the concern. We can't really threaten their survival. So we get into some sort of virtual reality games. They would walk around and move around, and then they would see an animal, and then they can choose to approach the animal or not. And some of those animals might be magnified, so you have a giant cockroach taller than you are in the VR setting, and that can create a sense of threat for them. And if they approach the animal, then they get to play a game with the animal. Essentially, you do a little working memory task. You try to remember a series of pictures, and whether the current one is the same as the one before, or the one even before that, something like that. So you have to look at a lot of pictures of that animal. If you really dislike that animal, let's say it's a worm or some kind of insects that you really don't like, then it's a bit of a challenge, and people tend not to approach those animals, even when the reward points might be very high. And we do have some pilot data showing that if they do overcome that discomfort to go and approach these animals in the VR setting, their physiological arousal does go up a little bit. So it's not exactly a survival related threat, but it does seems to get at something that is quite visceral and challenging. And then we use two ways to manipulate brain activity. One is called transcranial magnetic stimulation. So we applied a transient magnetic field over the head. And then if you target the right brain circuits, we can create some mild turbulence to the circuit. And likewise, we have a similar approach of using brain imaging to manipulate the activity. So usually we think of brain imaging as reading activity off the brain instead of writing. But in fact, when you read the activity in the fMRI scanner, if people shows a certain type of brain activity that we like to see, we can then tell the subject, oh, you just earned some reward. So that becomes a way for us to try to manipulate these survival circuits as well. The traditional view is that the subcortical areas, including areas like amygdala, that I'm sure you'll hear from my other colleagues in the team, these are the areas that people think is very related to how the animal or the human subjects would react. But I think in humans, that actually looks like those areas might be just driving a more basic, primitive survival-related response. So essentially, they're just driving your physiological arousal. But the actual subjective feeling of threat or subjective feelings of fear is actually more driven by the higher cognitive areas like the prefrontal cortex. And those are kind of more of our target of interest. So we're trying to target these areas and see whether we can actually dissociate the two kinds of response. That is the physiological reaction, the more primitive one, versus the more higher cognitive reports of how they consciously feel. Speaking from the preliminary data we had before, I think in general you expect it to be dicey, to be difficult to fully dissociate them. Fear tend to correlate a lot with these physiological responses, which I think has been why in the literature the two things are kind of muddled up. And in animal models, because we cannot ask the animal how they feel, sometimes the physiological response is even taken as a measure of the subjective cognitive fear. But if we put them in very specific situations and try to look very carefully, the two things can dissociate. And the project itself is about basic science, but I also mostly do basic science, but I think in terms of treatment, I think that's a huge potential here, because arguably the medicine that has been developed, I think they have targeted on circuits that are based on the animal models mostly. And so far they work to some extent, but they don't really target the subjective experience of the subject so much. And I think a lot of what we're doing is to go to the other side of the trade-off. Even though in humans we have to be more careful, we can't really try to really put them into really threatening situation, but we can ask them how they feel. And ultimately, when we try to develop treatment methods for people, it's the people's feelings that matter. I mean, people come and seek treatment because they feel afraid or they feel threatened. So if we are able to map out the different circuits and find targets that we can actually manipulate and change the subjective experience better to make people feel less threatened, my hope is the next step would be to try to actually bring these kind of basic science results to a more applied direction.